Welcome to Art Power, everybody. Art Power is a collaborative campaign from Hong Kong arts community celebrating the arts in Hong Kong in 2020. I'm Rosanna Harries, Art Power Hong Kong Working Group member, and I'm delighted that you are joining us for the 10th instalment of the weekly Art Power Online's talk programme. Today we are delighted to be discussing the changing face of museum exhibitions. Amongst some of the topics to discuss today, we will cover the relationship between institutions, curators and artists in the current social conditions, how the approach to curating shows will be affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and shifts in audience engagement and expectations. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Anna Dickie, content creator at Ocula, and your moderator for today. Anna, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Rosanna. It's a great pleasure to be here, back in Hong Kong in a way, which is wonderful. I'm actually coming in from Auckland. We have our panelists today, obviously coming from all around the world. We've got Polly, who is coming in from Italy, Cosmin and Peely, who are in Hong Kong, and Rachel, who is in Manchester. I'd like to start by introducing Polly Palmerini and Rachael Burns. They are the co-curator of a project called the Museum of Half-Truths, which will be presented in terms of an exhibition at 1A Space in Hong Kong, and that is coming up in August, which is something definitely to look forward to. We have Cosmin Costinas, who many people will know, particularly those Hong Kongers, Executive Director and Curator of Parasite, one of Hong Kong's very well-known non-profit institutions that has been, one of the oldest institutions in Hong Kong. It has a current exhibition, Garden of Six Seasons, which runs until 30 August in Hong Kong. Cosmin not only runs Parasite, but plays an important role in many other aspects. In particular, he will be the next artistic director of the Kathmandu Triennale. We have Peely, who is the Sigg Senior Curator, Visual Art from M+. Peely, of course, was just involved in the curating the Sigg Prize exhibition, which recently closed with, as you know, Samson Young being awarded the Sigg Fellowship for Chinese art for that. Peely was on the curatorial team of Media City Seoul in 2006 for Seoul Museum of Art, and has curated a number of museum shows since. So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone out there. And thank you very much to the panelists for all being here tonight. And of course to Art Power Hong Kong for making this all happen. What I thought would be really nice is to hear from Polly and Rachel about your project, Museum of Half-Truths. And I wondered if you could tell us about this project and what instigated it and how it came about.
Thank you so much for having us. So to introduce the project, both Polly and my background are in photography. And with photography, there's always this really interesting relationship between photography as evidence and truth. And obviously we all know that that is kind of quite a malleable relationship. So we were thinking about representations of power and how that relates to imagery, and how kind of throughout human history, imagery has been used to represent power, and how museums are kind of the modern day equivalent of that. They're what's recording our histories. We put huge trust in these institutions to be recording things for the future. So obviously it's impossible to create these spaces in a completely neutral way, whether that's in person or now online. And thinking about the kind of implicit bias in these spaces is how we came up with the title of Museum of Half-Truths. It's intended to be quite a playful take on a museum. We want to kind of take it apart and rebuild it and think about the elements that we really like about museums, and try and create a space that's really exciting and accessible, that kind of tells a variety of stories that are all a half-truth of something. So they're kind of maybe representing a story that wouldn't traditionally be told in a museum, or thinking about one very specific angle and kind of like learning a lot about that. So we're really interested in all artists that do this, and we're working with some really exciting ones for Hong Kong. For us, this project is really a learning experience. Polly and I are both early career curators, so we're kind of seeing this as an opportunity to just basically be sponges and learn as much as we possibly can from different international models, kind of embracing the fact that we know nothing and trying to like run with it and learn as much as possible from working with different artists and organizations. And there was a quote, actually, I was watching Asia Art Archive's Life Lessons. The first one was yesterday. And there was a quote from Pablo Helguera that I'd like to end on, which really succinctly sums up what we've been thinking about for the last 6 months, which was the best critique an artist can make of an institution is to create a new institution yourself.
Wow, and then you've taken up that challenge yourself, which seems, you know, incredibly brave. And so it was quite interesting here to have you guys coming in, as you say, you know, just starting to explore this world and some of the things that you're thinking about, and then to have somebody like Cosmin who's involved in you know, a smaller non-profit institution, very well known, established, but small, and then obviously Pili, you coming in from that aspect of being part of a big public institution. And I think, you know, it's kind of nice to think one of the topics you just raised was this idea of neutrality. And I'm interested, Cosmin and Pili, in, you know, putting the question to you. I mean, there is this sort of, do you feel this sort of sense of obligation to be transparent about the subjective angle in which you curate your shows, and how do you come at that? Because Pili, have you had thoughts on this?
Okay, yes. I think I'm still a believer that, yeah, every museum has their subjectivity or subjectivities. And I'm the believer that the museum has to, also be believer that the museum has to be mutual. So be mutual does not mean so we have to do any, we don't do anything on the other hand, or to be objective. For me, an objective museum is boring and also impossible. But M+, talking about the institution I'm now working in, the M+ is a museum with thousands of the objects in our collection, and be acquired for the various reasons, and with 33 galleries. And we are expecting like millions of the audience around the world every year. So on this note, our program from the collection display to the public activities are very rich, will be very rich and intensive. So they are touched on the different topics and stories from the different angles and the viewpoint. So being a mutual platform, the museum can accommodate like different viewpoints and voices on a single platform. So with this, I argue that the museum does not have a single subjectivity, but a multiple subjectivity, or museum is in between the objective and the subjective. Yeah.
And Cosmin, you know, what's your sort of response to that?
I think it's a very good question, because if we look at art institutions, museums or otherwise, there are different definitions, and there are different responsibilities that we all adhere to, but indeed some of their aspects are in conflict, because on one hand I fully agree with what Pili said, and indeed, you know, ultimately a museum, an art institution of any sort, relies on the work of artists primarily. It also relies on the work of curators and of other intellectuals. And as such, it is primarily responsible to the individuality of those creators, to their own personal, you know, subjectivities, indeed, using plural, to you know, the sometimes non-democratic decision of taking a choice over the other. But at the same time, indeed, you know, our institutions do have a public function, and they see themselves as agents in society, in the broader public sphere. And in order to operate there credibly, there needs to be a certain level of, well, transparency and you know, open responsibility. But I think it's very important to make it clear what aspects of what constitutes an institution is subjected to transparency, what aspects of it, you know, need to, you know, follow a certain public mandate, for example, and what other aspects need to give that subjectivity, that power, that you know, authorship to artists or other intellectuals involved in different cultural acts, which by definition are original, are irrepeatable, are arbitrary even, you know, if they come from an assumed responsibility. So this is, you know, a complex solution to a complex question. I mean, it's even if we, you know, seem to be liking, you know, very straight answers and black and white situation these days, it's you know, it's actually more of a complexity here, and this is something that we constantly need to negotiate ourselves inside the institutions, in the broader sphere, and more broadly with entire society and with all the stakeholders and political factors that are involved in, you know, keeping the whole system running.
Certainly, you know, I think one of the words that came across there is the word complexity. And I think both of you sort of, you know, you touched on this in terms of how do you present, first of all, so many different voices. You know, the museums seem to have taken on a lot of responsibility now, and that has become a lot more complex in the last few years. And you know, one thing I was you know, wanted to ask you, Cosmin, was I'd noticed with Parasite, you did a show at the beginning of the year that I think also very much looked at the topic of expanding what is defined as contemporary artistic practice. And I was interested in hearing you talk about that show and why you felt that, you know, the importance of expanding that definition.
Yeah, well, I think that that show in particular looked at contemporary practices in the Pacific, based primarily on lineages of bark cloth making and all the conversations that occur around, you know, defining the category to which this belonged to. I mean, why to expand the category? Because a lot of the borders that, and a lot of the walls to the definitions of what we count as art were imposed in different historical circumstances that we are now in a process of moving beyond. A number of practices were excluded from the definition of high art because they were primarily associated with women. You know, work that deals with textiles very often, work which deals with you know, particular materials and particular practices, which were traditionally associated with women makers, and as such they were labeled as craft, they were labeled as, you know, various other definitions that were nevertheless understood to be lesser than art. And this was quite a global phenomenon, and this applied to women makers, you know, from, you know, the core of art historical power to, you know, the furthest colonial points. And then there were other practices that were excluded from the narrative of what art is within that colonial process, because they were not produced in Europe, because their genealogy was you know, developing, taking place on other continents that were either colonized or were you know, marginalized by that Eurocentric narrative of what art is. So from the painterly traditions of China to you know, various performative practices, you know, anywhere. You know, I mean, this really applies to many other parts of the world. So I think given the overall historical moment in which we find ourselves, and again with all its complexities, but given the fact that almost all phenomena taking place today can be circumscribed to a process of decolonization, a process of moving beyond a certain very long historical era that relied on that structure of power and on that geography built by colonialism, I think the only way in which we can respond artistically, the only way in which we can contribute to, and the only way in which we can be timely, to these historical developments, is to work in this direction, in eliminating all these borders and definitions that were imposed in that colonial process of a Eurocentric gaze towards artistic practices from around the world, and again in the misogynistic version of exclusion towards practices that were gendered and happening in other places. So I think this is a very general work. It is the sort of like leading direction towards any kind of like responsible practice, institutional practice, curatorial practice, or artistic practice has to position itself in one way or another, to a certain extent or not, towards this direction. And then, of course, there's many ways in which this can be done. There's many, areas, directions that one can work on. There's also different positions that one can take, in this overall direction. But I think it's very difficult to argue against this historical direction ultimately.
Yeah. And I think, to a certain extent, the museums are taking this on, aren't they? They're I suppose, to put it simply, to some extent, righting wrongs. And I suppose that leads us to the next topic that I wanted to talk about, which, Rachel, you mentioned in your introduction, which was this idea of museums as agents of social change. This also seems to be something that I'm noticing a lot more, that museums, not only are they sort of presenting shows that make us think differently maybe about certain issues, but they're actually practically also maybe taking steps to have a direct impact on their communities. Again, sorry, Cosmin, to put you on the spot yet again, but it does lead into your paid studio visits that Parasite has just begun. I believe, you've had 2, I think, so far, is that right? But if you can tell us about the paid studio visits, and just give us a little bit of background on them and why you set them up.
Yeah, I don't want to take so much of the time of the discussion.
No, that's all right. Well, I'll make sure you don't. You're just up here for these first 2.
Yeah, we just started yesterday, so we had the first one yesterday, but then there's quite a few coming up. We're gonna try to make them bi-weekly, so two a week. Yes, I mean, they came as a response to the current situation of the COVID-induced stopping of a great part of the economy of the arts locally and primarily globally. So a majority of opportunities for artists to both show their work and promote their work and be able to meet with curators and to find further opportunities and opportunities for their livelihood to earn money were simply stopped. So it felt like a good formula to basically respond to these 2 needs in one go. So to create ultimately, this database of younger artists in Hong Kong and their work, and creating quite an easy and accessible a resource for curators, institutional practices, or maybe even collectors who would have otherwise, come in residencies, do research, and so on and so forth, and meet the artists in person. But now they would have this opportunity to, meet them digitally. But then equally importantly, it's also a way for the artists to be paid for their work. So it's a way for them to receive a fee that is not huge, but it's also, I think, not you know, particularly small for that time. And that's also the reason why we called it so bluntly. You know, we use the word paid at the beginning, and you know, we you know, package it like that because we want to contribute, you know, as much as we can to establishing a culture where artists and everyone else is paid for their work, where, you know, things are not done just for visibility or, you know, for whatever other argument. There's just simply no reason to do that. You know, there's, you know, artists should always be paid. They should always get fees. It's very easy, you know, if you can do an exhibition with 4 artists and you say that you cannot, you know, pay artist fees, you are wrong. It means you can do an exhibition with 3 artists, pay those 3 artists, and just, you know, invite the 4th artist at another occasion. So it's very simple. And we hope that, you know, this culture will eventually change. We're also, you know, somehow in the same line. I mean, all the artists who get fees also like get 1 month of health insurance. That's also something that we started at the beginning of the year to ensure a certain period of health insurance for Hong Kong artists that we work with, either for events or for exhibitions, so both for the duration of the show and for a certain period when you know, they prepare the exhibition. That can also work retroactively in case the work was produced earlier. And again, it's something that, you know, we like to talk about, not so much to you know, promote our work, but we hope that this can be an example that can be like taken by other institutions. And I think we all watched what you know, was what happened to in many institutions, primarily in the United States at the beginning of the crisis, with, you know, entire departments being fired and people being put out of work. And it's an utter shame. And I think that's something that we should continue saying. And, you know, this you know, many of the institutions are doing great work otherwise, and they contribute to expanding intellectually and artistically our field. And you know, many of the people there are our friends and our colleagues, but this has been a huge mistake that I think eroded their credibility and indirectly certainly like brought shame to our entire field. And this is something that they have to reckon with. And I think in the long term, you know, we have to hold them you know, responsible for these decisions that were taken in the very first weeks actually of lockdown measure in the United States. So not after, you know, a year of tragedy. So yeah.
It's kind of this. I agree with your sentiments, but and I'm also interested, Pili, to bring you into the conversation here, because this seems to relate in a way to, you know, how does an institution, aside from, you know, protecting its artists, protecting its staff, if we park that to one side at the moment, but, you know, do you see an increasing pressure on large institutions to ensure that they create shows that benefit a much wider group of artists? I suppose I'm asking the question, you know, can you see the pressure coming on a large institution where doing a blockbuster show for a solo artist may no longer be considered as acceptable as perhaps it was in the past, where instead there could be a group show that benefits a much wider group of artists, you know, younger artists? Can you see that, imagine that pressure coming on, or what's your sort of response to that idea?
Yeah, I think the post-pandemic situation will be quite a challenge, and people like the whole capacity of the museum will be reduced quite a lot, and the people are not freely to traveling. So all this will be kind of quite a challenge for this kind of the blockbuster show, which they need the sustainability. They have to sell the huge investment, and they need to get the generated income from the ticketing sales. I think that's very challenge, but I don't think that will be that the whole blockbuster show will be totally, the culture of the blockbuster show will be disappeared. I think it will come back in day, maybe after 2 or 3 years. That's the one thing. But I also agree with you that for the most cultural institutions, they are more, on one hand, they have to, they may have the program more rely on their collections and how to make the collection to tell the new stories, because the collection is there and they can be contextualized to tell the different stories. So that's why I give a museum this kind of the challenge. And also the young artist show, the group show, as you said, that's also very important approach to generate the new understandings.
Yeah. Of course, all of you have had individually, you've all been impacted in terms of your exhibition making. You know, I think Polly and Rachel, it'd be really nice to hear from you guys in terms of talking about the show that you do have coming up. First of all, to tell us a bit about it in Hong Kong, and then to talk about how COVID impacted you and how you came to kind of take on those challenges.
Yeah, so when we found out from 1A Space about the exhibition, it was around February, March. So we knew that there was going to be an impact on our exhibition. But we always knew that we were going to have a digital program that might have been a limited event or some talks. And the first part of our exhibition planning was going to be at a distance, as a like Zoom calls with Eugenia from 1A Space and the artist itself. So we had to be quite quick to adapt to the new softwares and the new exhibition planning. But our idea now is to go still to Hong Kong if we can, of course, if restrictions allow it. But we're planning on creating a physical and a virtual show and events that sort of align to each other, but they're very different. Because we've been reading a lot and looking at all these shows that are trying to replicate a physical experience. And I think it's very important for us to create a slightly different experience that might be more visual, like not only visual, but also audio, and can create more communication between different communities that can't interact, and also us that we can't interact with, maybe potentially Hong Kong. So thanks to 1A Space, we've been having had the opportunity to fund a show and work with these artists. So I think, yeah, the question is, how will we do this? And we're going to be doing digital events and programs and workshops, and also some physical ones if we manage to, with the artists, and sort of facilitating that conversation. But the planning at the moment is just going ahead with like sort of two lateral like plans that sort of align to each other. But yeah, so the show will happen in August, even if we can't go. So I think that's very important to implement a digital component in any exhibitions in the future. And I think that's really important for our project to go forward even after Hong Kong, that we have this website that you can all look at after this, that sort of wants to be an open space, a resource, and allow contributors to include blogs, also conversation discussions, and we're studying more ideas to have a more of an open conversation that might be on Zoom or reading groups. So yeah, I think it's just about like creating something new that isn't a replica of a physical show, I think, and we're hoping to do that.
And just to, I think you've got, is it 5 or 6 young artists from Hong Kong? Yeah.
So
and you did oh, sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, it's 5 artists, 4 from Hong Kong and 1 from Singapore. So Moses Tan is from Singapore. Then we have Lau Wai, Ip Wei Lung, Andrew Luck, and Stacey Chan. So it's been great to work with them, since they all, we found them through internet, so it's all been done quite at a distance through online resources, and they all work with their own responses to personal and historical archives, and these ideas that Rachel has said about myth, power, and also their personal relationship to their community. So I think it's just generating a sort of archive of connections of artists. So that's what we're planning on doing.
It sounds great. I mean, Pili, you also were impacted by COVID when the Sigg exhibition was shut down halfway through. To what extent was digital used to kind of bridge that gap before it then reopened?
Yes, it's unfortunately we got shut down for almost like 7 to 8 weeks for the 2-time shutdown. But we made some walkthrough videos and as a response to the pandemic, and we also not only a simple curatorial guide, and we also try to elaborate how this work related to the current human conditions, concerns. So I just want to say the access is always on the top of the mind of us, and digital content is obviously the best way to reach the audience when they are not physically able to attend any events. So more recently for the Sigg Prize exhibition, we also experimented not only the tour guide, but also the IG Live for our art chat series. And we will also continue to experiment this kind of the different platforms for the best way to connect our audience and give the new paradigm. But just want to make that clear that like we have been leveraged on this kind of digital for serious year in the leading of the up to the opening of our physical museums, not only because of the pandemic, but the pandemic really pushed us to be more active on this kind of digital strategy. So it's been an important part of our institution DNA over the past few years, and has allowed us to experiment with our storytelling outside of exhibition space to try the new things and develop the relations with our audience. So we have them like a Leon sign, M plus stories, and this kind of the newsletter of the digest, and of course of our presence on the various like social media sites are an important means for us to figure out what works and what doesn't, and find out more about our visitors are interested in. So we can see this kind of increase in the visitors traffic and engagement while the physical space was closed, and this was also possible the build sets that we have been for a digital perspective.
Yeah, there's certainly seen an acceleration, hasn't it, in the digital world. Cosmin, have you suddenly found yourself having to get to know Google Analytics and SEO? I know with the Garden of Six Seasons that was delayed, and I believe the exhibition has changed because you had to, now it has reopened, or has opened, sorry, but it has changed. Can you share some of the changes that you had to make and the learnings that you had through this?
Yes, not significantly. I mean, it was indeed like postponed for 2 months for obvious safety reasons. It's largely opening in the form that we anticipated from the beginning. So there were a few minor details connected to shipping that makes the actual final checklist slightly different. But I think at the scale of the overall show, it's not really major impact. There's some aspects in the exhibition where we decided not to have headphones for certain videos that would have had, and use directional speakers rather than things that would have touched people's faces. But largely it's we were able to open it as planned, and that's I think the privilege of being in Hong Kong versus being in other places where this was actually possible to be done, we hope, safely in this period.
Yeah. Obviously, and I think Rachel and Polly, you brought this up a little bit as well in terms of talking about your show and saying, now there's an obvious, we need to have the digital component and the physical component and all these other parts. Over the last 20 years, curators have had to really change how, what they learn, need to know about digital. And I'm interested, just by a nod or a shake of the head, everybody, I mean, do you think it's possible these days to put on a show and not have a digital element to it? I'm not talking about art, I'm talking about a digital way of involving the audience. Is it possible? Is it good? two no's, Cosmin and Pili, you're on the fence, are you? Do you think you could still have a show without a digital element to it?
Go ahead, Cosmin.
I'm a little bit on the fence about this, because on one hand, you know, they're like with, you know, most new technologies, or, you know, not so new, but you know, when most of the time, whenever technology is involved, there is actually a certain potential for and certain new possibilities. I mean, this is nice. We're certainly doing more talks than we would have done before. We're also, the culture around this immediately changed, so more people are tuning in. I mean, you know, we could have done something like this, you know, last year, but I think less people would have immediately thought that this is actually an option, and this is actually an interesting way to spend the afternoon. So there are these possibilities, you know, there's, you know, various ways of recording 3D exhibitions online. And I think they're actually very interesting possibilities if we regard them as another tool to document exhibitions. You know, if they're another tool together with installation shots, with videos taken, I think it's great that now there's other tools to record shows for people who are not here, or, you know, for posterity. But indeed, I think it's important to just understand, you know, the limits of this, and to understand that they're just, you know, tools for documentation, you know, rather than alternative venues, and that they're somehow equivalent to an actual physical exhibition taking place in a museum. And I think, you know, in the long term, definitely the experience of being in a museum, in a space will come back. There's no question about it. I mean, that has a way longer history, and also I'm sure that when safety will allow it, there will be this paradoxical reaction against everything that was not allowed during the pandemic. So I don't really like to speculate about the future, but I will now and say that I'm sure that there will be like some form of, you know, art practice or events that will involve touching and
yeah. I mean, let's hope we never, you know, we don't ever want the digital to replace the real. Absolutely.
But then the digital will be there, and there will be, like, you know, available tools, and that's in itself not a problem.
Rachael, I saw, I think both Rachael and Polly, you sort of shook your head kind of, you know, quite vigorously. But certainly your show that you have coming up, it seemed really important to you to have that digital element in terms of expanding the audience and who you could speak to and who you could touch and who you can engage with. Would that be correct? That is really important to you in terms of how you see shows now as extending the audience and who's engaged in it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know a lot of the conversations in the UK have been around disabled artists and activists who've been crying out for this kind of access for years. And then suddenly, when it benefits the masses, kind of not just with art institutions, I know kind of universities, there's been a lot of anger around that as well, justifiably so. So I think actually to then remove everything completely from online and go back to purely physical exhibitions, although I appreciate there are things that you can't do in an online space. I think that not having any element of the programme online and accessible is kind of, would be a real shame. And I think this kind of change is difficult because I think for sustainable change, it needs to happen kind of incrementally. And with this, it's been a sudden adaptation, and everyone's, I mean, museums were working online before, but it's been such a quick kind of turnaround that we've been unable to access these spaces when there've been people who've been living in that situation for many years. So I think there are things that we can do to kind of create an interesting, it doesn't replace that experience, but then there are things you can do online that you would never be able to do in a physical space. I know, like, Polly and I have got a fair few pieces of video work in the show, and we were saying actually you're much more likely to sit and watch quite a long film. I mean, I'm outing myself here, but I wouldn't sit and watch the entirety of an artist's film in a gallery always if it's kind of an hour long and you're on a very uncomfortable bench and you're aware that other people might want to access the space. So I think there are certain things that we can do that can kind of bring art. I think they need to ideally, in an ideal world, they would kind of work in tandem and bounce off each other and enhance each other.
Yeah, I think one thing I've really enjoyed is the seeing curators do their studio visits, because to me it felt like a real sort of unveiling of some of that knowledge gathering that happens behind an exhibition, and there's sort of a bit of an agency to the audience that eventually sees that exhibition, in hearing some of that raw material as such that the curator then goes and uses and filters and presents an exhibition. I thought the studio visits have just been really fantastic to kind of feel as though you're with the curator on their journey. Another way that I think, just more practically speaking, it seems that curators' day-to-day jobs have changed is, I heard the director of the Tate talking on a podcast about the fact that she was able to visit and meet and talk to people from all over the world sort of in one day. And she said, in fact, she was finding she was having a lot more meaningful meetings than she had before. I mean, she talked about not being jet lagged. And, particularly given the environmental considerations, I'm wondering if we're going to see a reduction in the amount of travel that the art world does. The art world is notorious for jumping on planes to go to biennales, if they have the privilege to do that. Cosmin, I will put it to you, can you see there being less travel now, as a result of this, maybe more thinking around whether a curator is going to travel to Biennale, whether, or not Biennale, travel to go and meet up, let's say, with other curators in New York for a conference, when that conference can be now potentially by Zoom? Do you think we'll see a reduction in the amount of travel that curators do? Or do you think it's still too important to have those face-to-face meetings?
Well, I mean, I'm sure that for the at least for the next few years, there will be a reduction that will come from significantly reduced budgets. So I think the kind of economic implications of the current health crisis will be such that a lot of the opportunities for travel will simply not be there. So I think that's probably the most obvious one, the most obvious consequence of it. So I don't know in the long term. I mean, obviously, I also, like mentioned earlier, there's something about physical presence that is a crucial element of art and of experiencing art. We're now seeing that, less so in the case of other types of events. So indeed, like certain kinds of like physical meetings and even events could certainly like happen without the investment that the travel requires. But yes, I think the most obvious consequence of this would be, the reduction in travel because of economic means and reduction in economic means.
Yeah. I'm also, I mean, we talked a little bit before, actually there was some, touching on the way just generally museum shows are likely to change. I mean, Pili, are you sort of looking ahead in terms of your safety practices? Shows that potentially before would have included performance, potentially can't anymore if it involves an interaction. I imagine, is there already sort of set guidelines that are coming up around shows that will have a practical impact on the type of art that is going to be able to be shown in the future?
Yeah, we are still in the moderating the situation and see how the pandemic goes in the next years and how that will be changed.
Yeah.
But I think the first thing we are pretty sure the pandemic will influence the visitors numbers for museum, and even like for the social distancing, we will reduce the capacity of the show. So basically, many show like we may sell the tickets by hours or this kind of thing. So that's already will be quite change a lot of this kind of exhibition cultures, and the performance is one of the things we may talking about that, and even for this kind of public talk screening programs. But we are still monitoring the situation. We try to find out how that really impact that. So it's quite like we don't know definite answer. You only can try. If this will work out, you try again. If this not work out, you try the other way again. I just feel now it's too early to say what is real, like the definite impact now.
Yeah. We have got, I can see we've got 15 minutes left for this talk, and there are a few questions that are coming through from the audience. And I am going to pick a couple of them. They're quite long questions, but I will try and summarize them down. One person has asked, anonymous, unfortunately, this is for you, Pili, he's asked, or he or she has asked about museums, about the interaction between subjectivity and objectivity. So sort of going back to what we first sort of opened the talk with. Now this is quite a tricky, I'd like to know, what does Mr. Pili think about MoMA's controversial exhibition, Primitivism in 20th Century Art, Affinity of the Tribal and the Modern? Is it MoMA's responsibility to correct notions put forward in that exhibition? It's actually a really interesting question. Does a museum, let's say MoMA, recognizing an exhibition it staged some years ago is no longer acceptable in some of the notions it put forward, does it have a responsibility to revisit that exhibition?
Yes, of course. When we talk about the subjectivity or objectivity, I think that's like a museum is a symbolic place. So people, when we ask these questions like what's your subjectivity, what's your responsibility for history, they always have this kind of the presumption that you only do one exhibition. But I think one exhibition cannot solve all the problems. One exhibition only can talking about one thing. If you think that's not correct, you think something be more interesting, make another show. And you are not only open the museum, then you close. So when you're asking, I totally think the MoMA show it's a great show to correct the history, and that's also why the M+ building here for. The M+ building here for, we want to present the 20th to 21st century from the perspective of our region. So that's also a way to correct the whole museum discourse or exhibition discourse. I want to summarize that, like every exhibition or every program only can present, discuss a few questions. If we found that's not enough, we make another show.
Yeah, thank you. Polly and Rachel, I wondered if you had sort of a view on that as to whether museums had an obligation to revisit shows that potentially now had raised issues that needed to be rediscussed. I mean, could you see that happening? Are there any shows that you think, oh, it's time they redid that one?
What I've really liked to see in a few UK institutions is that they've gone around, I know that Tate Britain have done this, and also at the Harris, which is in the Northwest, they've either got in, with the Harris, it was some young producers who've then worked with the collection and who've kind of created their guide to the museum from that perspective. So I think it's difficult because I think some things maybe you can't deny that ever happened, but I think maybe by getting new perspectives in and trying to kind of use that as a route into the work, I think producing as many different routes into the work as possible is kind of the best way around that. And to try and think about, so for example, the one in Tate Britain, which I really loved, was queer artists and academics wrote captions for the images. So as you go around, you can find these little captions that give you a completely different reading into the work that kind of really enhanced my experience of that space. It was done in quite a subtle way, but I think it's really, really important that we keep pushing for these types of interventions in the space.
Whoops, thank you. Just reading through this, excuse me for not reading this as quickly as I could, but they are quite long questions. Joe, we have had one audience member has asked about the responsibility.
I can't hear.
Oh.
I can hear Anna.
You can't hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Am I back on? Give me the thumbs up, team, if you can hear
back.
me. Great, thanks, Cosmin.
Yes.
Has asked about how to represent, though he's talked about the curator having the ultimate power in selecting which narratives are worth sharing and which are not. How does a curator represent those who have not been represented before? I suppose this, in a way, it was slightly answered right at the beginning, wasn't it, in terms of the responsibility to provide, to reflect on a collective memory. Cosmin, do you think about that in terms of when you do your shows? I mean, you did talk about that as far as the show that you did that focused on Tongan art, you know, about representing those who maybe had not had a voice before in an institutional space.
Well, I mean, it also depends who we're talking about and the framework and what everyone does. So, I mean, that show in particular, I mean, the curator was Lady Tuna Fiela-Kepa, who has had a very long work life and career of research. Lived in Tonga all her life after her studies. And it's a good example because it's actually, you know, she's in her mid-80s now, and then this is the first time that she actually curated an exhibition about the research work that she had done throughout her life. And she had had a distinguished career in advising museums around the world, in you know, helping curators there to, you know, put on their selection of artists, and you know, in the best case scenario, she was invited to write a text for a catalog curated by, you know, people at that museum. So it's actually the first time, you know, at this venerable age that she actually curates an exhibition herself. So I think that's quite telling on this issue somehow.
Mm. Yeah, thank you, Cosmin. I think we're probably about ready to wrap this up, and I wondered, there is a further question though that's I can just see that's come in. Obviously incredibly sensitive for everyone now in Hong Kong with the recent announcements, but there are a few people asking what the obligation is on art spaces in Hong Kong to respond to the political climate. And I think probably in Pili, you know, what is the obligation on any institution to respond directly to the political climate that surrounds it? It might be MoMA in relation to the Trump administration, Hong Kong in relation to China, you know, and on and on. So I think we can deal with that in a general sense. Yeah,
for me, it's like until now, for this moment, I think the curatorial freedom and the freedom of speech are protected in our institution, and we are soon after to show our collection. But I think there are two layers here. For me, it's like we always believe the museum, like a work art center slogan, the museum is always the safe place for the non-safe idea. So that's like with something, a territory, a place we can protect for artists. But on the other side, I still think a museum is a mutual place. A museum is a place have to look into the different subjectivities, have to look at the different people have the different political opinions, and that's the way it's a platform to raise up the discussion. So it's not pure about it. Yeah, that's what I understand. But the museum is really a safe place for non-safe idea, and that's what we are trying to achieve, and we will achieve that.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, quite a nice place to end in terms of the discussion with that safe place for unsafe ideas. I just thought on a light note, it would be nice to hear from all of you just a quick suggestion on great museum shows or great digital experiences you've had that you could recommend to other people. You're not allowed to recommend your own one. Polly, I know you and Rachel had some ideas for what
yeah.
visitors could go and see or you know, visit online that you thought were particularly good.
Yeah, I have one, of course, like more in photography, but there was a Screen Walks from Photographers Gallery in London, and they're doing a series of talks that happen on on the screen of the artist or the researcher. So you're basically, there's some that you're going through the desktop of an artist and you can see their archive, and you're actually having a conversation about different things they've done. There was different game environments, tours, or the preferred virtual spaces, and I think it was a quite slightly different, not maybe like the paid studio, but it was in entering the world of an artist from a distance. And I think that's something that usually you don't have a chance, and you have this very polished, I think we were talking about this very polished presentation of a gallery and an exhibition space. So yeah, I'll put the link in the chat, but I find that really useful.
It's lovely. Rachel, did you have something?
Yeah, I've put Polly's links in the chat. Mine's quite a silly one, but I really like it. The Victoria and Albert Museum is created this little game where you design a 18th century wig. So you drag it out on your phone, and it's like very, very relaxing and a nice way to waste a little bit of time. Yeah, it's something quite silly, but I like it.
Yeah. Cosmin, anything you have been that you particularly enjoyed? It's fine if it's Netflix.
Well, yeah, sure. I don't think I have necessarily something useful to say here, but I mean, yes, there's, you know, so many great films from around the world available in this period. So I would say, like, you know, why not, you know, take a chance to see those, and then, you know, find ways to, you know, see exhibitions in real life when this will be safe and possible. So, you know, there's come back and see the shows is what we're all trying to say, aren't we? Go and support your museums and support your artists. Pili, have you got one to finish us off with?
I partially agree with Cosmin that like to see the film, but however, yeah, what I hear the Parasite paid interview with the artists is quite interesting. One of them. But I also want to say that the pandemic is really reshaping our digital strategy. If I see what's happened in the last 3 months, I feel a little bit overwhelming about all this kind of digital content, just bump into the Instagram, Facebook, social media, and the online things. And this also makes we are a little bit overwhelmed. We even cannot finish them all. And this also forces us to think, what's something new digital program we can offer to audience, and also what's the sustainability to make this kind of the digital program in the long run. So I think that's also a challenge for the museum digital programs, and we treat that very serious. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much to everybody for being involved in this, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in. I'm sorry I haven't got all the, there has been some good questions, and I'm sorry I haven't asked them. I could see we're running out of time, and I didn't know if I could read them quickly enough and translate them into it as well as I would have liked to. So thank you everybody, and thank you very much, Rosanna, for putting this all together.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Cosmin. Yeah. Bye. Bye.
Thank you everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks very much to Art Power Hong Kong.